Hi.
Richard.
Hey. Good seeing you.
Yeah, good to see you.
Yeah, so I wanted to do this session on flying toys because it was such a heartfelt story. I showed it to my brother John and I showed it to my wife, and they said, you got to capture this, on Jeff, reading that story. That is it's absolutely incredible. It's a true story, and
Yeah, nothing's embellished. I mean, it's all, I didn't use creative liberties.
yeah. So yeah. Well, why don't you give the audience a little bit of a background? I think you said you were 4 years old, 5 years old. So
I was almost 5 when we moved to Venezuela.
Okay.
Yeah.
So maybe you can just give a little bit of background and then read the story. The background where you were living in Venezuela, and then you went to for Christmas holidays to.
Yes. We lived in Venezuela. It was the 1950s, and the airplanes were prop. There weren't jets, and so it was a big deal to go from Venezuela to the United States. I mean, today it's nothing. It's about a 2.5 hour flight to Miami or something like that.
Yeah.
But back then it wasn't like that. In fact, on one trip, the airplane caught on fire. The engines, I remember looking out the window and seeing flames coming off the engine. This was in the late 50s, and Havana, Castro had taken over all of Cuba but Havana. And he had surrounded Havana, and they were closing in on Havana. And because the plane was on fire, we had to land in Havana in the middle of a revolution. In fact,
oh my gosh,
end of the revolution. So we landed in Havana, and I'll never forget the tension in the airport. I mean, there were just hordes of people trying to get out of Cuba, and because Castro was taking all their money and their possessions and everything. So people were desperate, and we had to wait in the Havana airport for 8 hours for a plane from Miami to eventually come and pick us up and take us on to New Orleans. But that was quite a scene. And
oh my gosh, I bet that was. Oh,
yeah, I mean, it was just like, wow, soldiers everywhere with weapons, and just the frantic crowd just desperate to get out. I mean, some people, I'm sure, were in fear of their lives if they stayed. So, and then during that 4.5 years of Venezuela, there were 4 revolutions. They were like having one government overthrow a year at that time.
Oh my gosh! Oh wow!
It was pretty wild. And, there was a time in Venezuela when the communist guerrillas had formed I guess some kind of army, and they weren't that far from the camp where we lived. We lived in an expat camp, and it had barbed wire fence around it, but they were closing in, and the U.S. Marines were right offshore waiting to pick us up in case they breached the camp. And my father set me up with a shotgun at a spot on the porch, and with a device to load shotgun shells. So I spent all night just loading shotgun shells, looking for, guerrillas to come at us. And so I armed me as a little kid,
Oh my! And you were 4 years old?
Oh no! I mean, I was 4 when we got there. I was 9 when we left.
Okay, 9. Okay.
Yeah, I was 7 or 8.
Even
7 or 8 at this time. But when I was around 4, though, when we first went to Venezuela, he dressed me up as a little cowboy suit, and he put a real .38 pistol in my pocket to get it through customs.
Okay.
And so I walked right through customs with a real .38 pistol in my little holster. It was a crazy time. And there was a time where my father had a friend named Tony Ferrari, this Italian fella, and he built me a go-kart, but he put a racing body on it, and his last name was Ferrari. So when I was a little kid, I had a Ferrari. 70 miles an hour, my little go-kart. So it was pretty fast.
Yeah. Oh my gosh.
I drove it that fast. So it was just, you know, those are very influential years, those early years from, you know, before you're 10 years old. And
Oh, most definitely. Yeah.
one of the things I remember that really stuck with me was we were going to Maracaibo, I think it was, and the highway went along the lake and went by a slaughterhouse. And I remember seeing a feeble old woman with a big bone in her hand, and on the other end of the bone was a buzzard that had that end in its mouth, and they were like going through this tug of war over this bone.
Oh my
And
gosh. Oh,
I'll
whoa.
never forget that. It just like, oh my God, this woman, that's what she has to do to survive, you know? And so
Wow.
it's seeing a lot of poverty that you know, instilled something in me. Like, I don't waste food, you know, I don't, you know, I'm very thrifty in a lot of ways because of what I witnessed growing up. And,
Yeah.
you know, very Crocus once, and buildings were bombed out. There had been one of the revolutions, and the planes had you know, dropped bombs on the streets and machine gunned the sides of buildings. And that was my childhood.
Oh my gosh.
But so, you know, then there was that Christmas, that time we went to Christmas, and I lost the suitcase, which is, you know, what the story I wrote about it
Yeah.
was about. So I have it on, if you want me to read it, I've got it on.
Yeah. Most definitely. Yeah.
Okay, I'm gonna have to open the document to see this, and then minimize it. All right, you could see me, but I can't see you. So do you want me to just start reading it?
Yeah. Just start reading. Yeah.
I have to wear my glasses. I call it Flying Toys. Our family was very happy together. We only came to the States once a year. My father served ice cream, and my mother sat on the couch with Mana and her mother. Mana was my mother's mother. And I sat with Granny, who was my grandfather, my mother's father, whom I loved dearly. He told the best stories ever. I mean, he made up this story about a little boy and his dog, and he made up chapters, and he could have written a book and probably made a lot of money just about this boy and his little dog. And but he would make them up, and he was just the best storyteller ever.
Wow.
His name was Little Johnny, and he had a trusty dog named Ringo. Sister Sue. That year, I received the toys that I most wanted. Santa Claus read my letter. A favorite present was the little plastic airplane that was connected to a line about 8 feet long. It had a handle with a battery-powered trigger to operate the plane's speed. I could hardly wait to get back to Venezuela and show it to my friends. Our vacation to the U.S. was only a week old, and we were leaving to visit my mom and Pop, my grandparents on my father's side of the family. I always enjoyed the drive from Biloxi, Mississippi to St. Martinville, Louisiana, where my father's family gathered on Christmas Day to celebrate. As we were getting ready for the drive from the pine forest of Mississippi to the swamps of Louisiana, I gave my toys one last look. Then they disappeared into the suitcase that held them. I felt like we were going to another country. The two places were that different. I couldn't always understand what my Cajun cousins were talking about since they all spoke French with each other. Still, it was a pleasure to visit them, as they always hugged and kissed me and were very warm. My aunts and my grandmother served really great food. The gumbos, cracklins, hot sausage, crawfish they prepared in so many ways always filled the holiday table. Even though I thought of the spicy food waiting in Morgan City, I enjoyed the breakfasts of buttermilk pancakes and sausage my grandmother had fixed here in Gulfport. After eating, we packed the U-Haul trailer, hugged my grandparents, and waved goodbye as we pulled away heading for Louisiana. It really was my best Christmas. I had more presents than ever before. We had packed one small suitcase that contained all my presents and nothing else. I had realized that it would mean I had realized what it would mean when my father mentioned to my mother about his raise in salary, but I didn't know that I was on the good end of his hard work. When we arrived in St. Martinville, not Morgan City, by the way, that was a mistake. It was St. Martinville. When we arrived in St. Martinville and began unpacking the trailer, I discovered that the suitcase with all my Christmas presents had fallen off. My stomach went queasy and my heart raced as my eyes swelled with tears and soon became a flood. It turned out to be the worst Christmas ever, one I'd never forget. A few days later, we returned home to Venezuela. I only had a couple of small presents that my Cajun relatives had given me. I often daydreamed of finding that suitcase filled with my Christmas presents. In Venezuela, that was a very distant dream. The next summer, we moved back to the United States. We stayed with my mother's parents in Gulfport. Their house was only a block from the Gulf of Mexico. One day, while walking on the beach, I met Kevin, a kid about my age, and we at once became the best of friends. He took me to an old barn where his family lived in the hayloft. It was the first time I had ever seen a homeless family in the United States. Having come from South America, I was used to seeing poverty, but this was a real shock. They were really poor. When my grandmother found out who my friend was, she threatened me with a spanking if I continued to see him. She even called his family white trash. She played religious hymns on the piano and sang about the coming of the Lord. My grandparents didn't have much either. I didn't understand why my grandmother's feelings, a lack of feelings for someone who had less than she. I cried and tried explaining to her how much my friendship with Kevin meant to me, but she would have none of it. Christ did not want me associated with such riffraff, she told me. She was a devout Southern Baptist and spent much of her time reading the Bible. She justified her actions through the pages of the good book. My parents didn't mind Kevin. They told me that our friendship was okay, so I began sneaking out and playing games with Kevin in places where my grandmother would not find us. One hot and humid day, while my friend and I walked on the beach, he began telling me a story. He said that the previous Christmas had been very sad for him. It was, he said, the worst Christmas in his life. He and his younger brother and sister received no presents at all. He told me that he came to the beach to walk his tears away, and while ambling along the seawall, crying to himself, he noticed a suitcase lying next to the highway. He ran to it. It was undamaged. It would contain something useful to his family, maybe, he thought. He could give as a present to his mother, who also didn't receive anything that Christmas. He pulled the suitcase away from the road and onto one of the steps of the seawall. He opened it and quickly became a believer in Santa Claus again. It was full of toys. Toys for someone his age. It turned out to be the best Christmas in his life. He told me that his favorite toy in the suitcase was a little plastic battery-operated airplane. I couldn't believe what I was hearing. He described the contents of the suitcase with all of my Christmas toys. I stood on the beach in shock. My mind was racing with my own memories of the plastic airplane and other toys that had once belonged to me. I looked at the smile on his face. I looked in his eyes and I saw his joy. I decided not to tell him that, and for a few hours, those toys had once belonged to me. And let me read that again. Oh yeah, I decided not to tell him that for a few hours, those toys had once belonged to me. I know I had told him, I know had I told him, he would have given everything back, even if I had insisted he keep it all. We moved to Louisiana a few days later, and I never saw Kevin again or the Christmas toys that were now his.
Wow,
I didn't read that very well, but I messed up a couple times.
Hey, well, that's life, that's part of reading a story. You can't be perfect,
I'm not the best reader out loud anyway.
Wow. And when I talked to my wife about that, how mature you were, at 4 or 5 years about that. That is for me, that is an incredible part, that you were installed somehow, with that conscious of living way back then. And that's extremely powerful, because most kids would say that was mine. I want my toys back.
Yeah.
And it takes the insight. Oh, so you definitely at a young age, to develop insight on how other human beings, think. So that's a unique character. It's needed in this world today, especially when people are flaming each other on Facebook, all the time.
Yeah. Right.
Yeah, and that's what I like about your posts too. I love when you have pictures of nature. Just goodness, and so I'm going to include this. As I told you, I'm writing a book on storytelling. So this is one of those perfect stories.
Great. One of them.
Well, I guess today we'll keep it short, but
All right.
again, thank you for sharing, and yeah, well, let's have future conversations. I always enjoy every single time. You kind of brighten up my day.
Great. Thank you. My pleasure, Richard. You the same back to you.
All right. Oh, once again, thanks. And
You're welcome. All right.
I'll talk to you later.
Okay. Bye.
Bye.